So odds are that part of the story about these dams being destroyed to save the fish is just a meme and it's not true. But before you think I'm letting Gavin Newsom off the hook, I got to get to the financials of California. Remember when I said California's financials are just insane to understand? According to Statista, here's a breakdown of tax revenue by state. California makes $220 billion in tax revenue. The next biggest is New York at $125 billion, about $100 billion less. Texas, which is really profitable, a well-run state, has no income taxes. So as a result, they only collect $86 billion. So we have $220 billion each and every year. So by far and away, the largest tax collector in America. Now let's contextualize it one step further and compare that with the entire GDP. That's every dollar a country makes, okay? Now here's a list of the top countries by GDP. There are only 56 countries on Earth with a GDP higher than California's tax income from taxes. The rest of these countries all have a lower GDP than what California makes, not from GDP. California's GDP is insane. It's in the trillions, just from taxes. So when I hear that we have to cut, we don't have money for $130,000 to tear a liner, that we don't have $17 million for firefighters, I got to tell you, I'm, as a long-term Californian, completely fed up with this. I think our financial state is absolutely insane. A lot of countries, a lot of states don't have the kind of money to take on large infrastructure or to fix all their problems. That's not the case here. $220 billion goes a long way. So what do we actually spend it on? I'm going to put how insane $220 billion every year is in context. But first, we have to talk about how are we spending this? How is California in a budget deficit? It's absolutely maddening. So I pulled up the data, and what I wanted to know is how is it changing over time? So over here is the 2017, 2018 numbers, and over here is last year's numbers, okay? And I wanted to just show the difference in growth. So if we look over here, the largest growth sector is a bucket of money called health and human services. The second largest is K through 12 education. Let's talk about K through 12 education first. You might be thinking California is the biggest state in the union. That is true. We are the biggest state in the union, but maybe not for long. Here's a look at enrollment numbers for K through 12. We hit our peak of over 6.3 million students back in 2004, and we have been on a decline ever since. And the latest numbers I could find is about 5.8 million, okay? So that means that we now spend 150% more, or $27 billion more on K-12 education for less students. And by no report I've ever seen does California somehow get a miraculous grade of some of the greatest schools in the nation. It's not the case at all. So this has to do with administrative bloat. So that's salaries being paid to non-teaching positions, right? I am a huge advocate of public schools. I believe that's the great equalizer. If you want to give people equal opportunities, invest in great schools across the board, not only in rich neighborhoods, everywhere. But what we have done is hired administrators, and there's a level of bloat that's really prevalent, especially in higher education. The number of positions, the number of non-teaching positions has gotten completely out of control, and we have to fix that. We cannot spend that much money per student, which is way more than any of the really great countries spend for these kinds of outcomes. I think that's something that has to be better. But as if the general fund wasn't enough, we have special funds, we get bonds, we can't even stick to our original budgets, and as a result, this is why we run in deficits. But this amount of money for health and human services is probably the spending that everyone gives California a hard time over. This is the homelessness problem, this is low-income housing, this is all those projects. So that means that K-12 education and health and human services is nearly $200 billion. Again, we make about 220. I think this year might be 230. Well, we'll see after all this. But that's a huge amount of our spending. Now, before I get into how the health and human services is performing, here's a general call to reason. We should tell all of our elected officials to return to a 2016 budget. That was around 183 all in. and enforce that. Because I think we need to have $40 to $50 billion of surplus to handle disasters and to have a massive water reclamation and water mitigation project that should span a long time. But when you have this much money coming in, it's more than doable. So how's the homeless problem going? California has 188,000 homeless people. That's about a quarter of all the homeless people in America. And that number grew 3% year over year. And it basically grows every year. The homeless population is growing. Now, does that mean that more people are falling into homelessness? Or are we attracting homelessness? I mean, California has some of the best weather in America all year round. There are places in California you can live outside in a tent all year. Those things I don't know, but I can tell you that these plans are not working. And there's huge levels of unaccounted for allocations, money not being spent properly, and all the rest. But to put that into perspective, that part of the government is eating up $114 billion. That cannot continue. If we cut that in half and forced California or 50 billion or some number, they might actually have better outcomes because maybe we'd have better people in charge who could do a better job of handling it. By the way, that $220 billion doesn't include property taxes, okay? The average per capita that a person in California pays is $19.50 per person, okay? The population of 39 million people, that's $76 billion every year in property taxes. Now, that money isn't counted to the state because it goes into local coffers, but that's another nearly $80 billion. Combined, $300 billion. Think about that for a minute.